Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here on such an important day, more so since it's the first time that this is being organized as a virtual event. I am Dr. Vasundhara Venkateshwaran. I'm a professor in the Department of Surgery and a graduate coordinator at the Institute of Medical Science. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 10th Ori Rotstein Lecture in Translational Research, and it's my privilege to have chaired this lectureship since its inception in 2011. This lectureship was established to recognize Dr. Rotstein's 25-year engagement with the Institute of Medical Science, and by establishing this annual event, the lectureship not only recognizes Dr. Rotstein's leadership, but it also contributes to the ongoing development of the academic life of the IMS by bringing together faculty and students for an outstanding scientific exchange. Dr. Rotstein is a graduate faculty member of the IMS since 1986. He became the associate director under Dr. Mel Silverman in 1991, and upon Dr. Silverman's retirement, assumed the role of acting director of IMS and then on as director in 2001. Dr. Rotstein completed his 10-year term as director of the IMS in June 2011, at which time this lectureship was established. Dr. Rotstein is a professor and associate chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of Toronto. He was named the inaugural Keynote Chair in Research Leadership at St. Michael's Hospital and the University of Toronto. The 5-year chair, which began in January of 2017, was developed to support a world-class scientist. Ori is now Vice President of Research and Innovation, Unity Health Toronto, which comprises of Providence Health, St. Joseph's Health Centre, and St. Michael's Hospital. In the context of this lectureship, I would like to share with you as to our keynote speakers in the past years, highlighting the diversity of this lectureship. I'm not going to go through the whole panel, but Dr. Lyle Palmer was a noted inaugural speaker at in 2011, and he spoke about health policy. He's from the Ontario Health Studies. And this was followed by many prominent faculty from various universities, including from North Dakota School of Medicine, McMaster, our own from the Ottawa Health Art Institute. And we had some breast cancer researchers from BC Cancer Agency. And we also had some of our own faculty, Dr. Molly Shurkett from U of T, who does some excellent work on stem cells. More recently, we were proud to have our alumni, Dr. David Hackham from Johns Hopkins, who did a fantastic presentation on neonatal enterocolitis. We are extremely pleased to have with us today Dr. Kwame McKenzie, who will render a keynote address. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. McKenzie, for accepting our invitation to be here at this very special event. We've also put together an excellent panel that will be holding discussions highlighting journeys through research. And this is something that is very dear to our students. This will be moderated by Dr. Rotstein himself. The panel includes several of our own faculty and a few of our alumni. Without further delay, I would like to now invite Laura Best, student lead of the Ori Rotstein Organizing Committee, to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the 10th Annual Ori Rotstein Lecture in Translational Research. On behalf of the IMS, I'm delighted to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Kwame McKenzie. Dr. McKenzie is the CEO of Wellesley Institute and is an international expert on the social causes of mental illness, suicide, and the development of effective, equitable health systems. Dr. McKenzie is also Director of Health Equity at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, and a full professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. As a policy advisor, clinician, and academic with over 200 papers and 5 books and numerous awards, he has worked across a broad spectrum to improve health and health services for over 2 decades. He's a member of the National Advisory Council on Poverty, a member of Canada's Expert Advisory Panel on COVID-19 and Mental Health, and served as part of Canada's delegation to the High-Level Political Forum on the Social Development Goals. Dr. McKenzie was previously a Human Rights Commissioner for Ontario, an advisor to Ontario's Basic Income Pilot Project. He sits on the board of United Way Toronto and the Ontario Hospitals Association. In addition to his academic policy and clinical work, Kwame is a columnist for The Guardian, Times Online, and Toronto Star, and a past BBC radio presenter. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kwame McKenzie.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be giving the 10th Ori Rotstein Lecture to you at IMS. And thank you to Laura and the team for your support and all the people who put this day together. It's very difficult to put a whole day like this together. The title of my talk is Health Equity by All Means Necessary. And as you'd expect at this time, in this time of our lives, it's a story of COVID. And I think there were three things we knew before the pandemic, which are important setting for setting up this talk about equity. The first is that 85% of our risk of illness is social. This is the work by the Canadian Medical Association, which they've tried to quantify what makes Canadians sick. And their quantification was that 50% is your life, like income, early childhood development, disability, education, housing. 10% is your environment, the air quality, but also the civic structure. And 25% is your healthcare. And what they mean by that is your access to healthcare, the healthcare system, and also wait time. So when you add the 50 to the 25 to the 10, you get to 85%. 85% of the risk of any illness is social, and then 15% is your biology. So we knew that. That was the first thing we knew. The second thing we knew is that there are disparities in our exposure to these different social factors. So that cause illness, such as poverty, such as precarious housing, such as discrimination. And we know that that increases your vulnerability to infection. And so racialized populations have an increased vulnerability to infections because of the social causes. And we actually have data on that from the H1N1 influenza pandemic. And so we knew in Ontario, in that pandemic, the data was clear that the Southeast Asian population were 3 times more likely to be infected by the H1N1 flu bug. The South Asian population was 6 times more likely to be infected, and the Black population were 10 times more likely to be infected. So we knew those 3 things going into the pandemic: social causes, risk different for ethnic groups, and specifically the risk is different in pandemics. But despite that, we went into the COVID-19 pandemic with a one-size-fits-all pandemic strategy, which would predictably not work as well for racialized people as it would have others. And we should have known better. And by May, when the science and the data started rolling in, it became clear that we really should have known better. The US and the UK started reporting that their Black populations were at least twice as likely to be infected with COVID-19, twice as likely to be hospitalized, and twice as likely to die. Not long after that, George Floyd was killed and Black Lives Matter was on the rise. And so we were in a situation where we could see significant differences in risk of the pandemic. We could also see a rise in consciousness about inequities and racial inequities. But in Canada, we didn't have the data or the structures in place to do anything about it. So what I'm going to describe today is how we linked science, community activists, the media, and political leverage to push for socio-demographic data collection in Ontario and in Canada, and then how we've tried to take the data and apply that to changes in the pandemic response and also in the wider social response to inequities. So it's a story of applied science. And I am a scientist who wants to make change. And the journey I've had in my own career has been about developing various skills and approaches that allow the translation of science into social change. And I'm going to be talking in three parts. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how you make change in a media-driven world. I'm going to be talking a little bit about translating that work into actual action. And then the last, and the coda, is about the fact that science doesn't stop. And so we need to, once we believe we've made a difference and we've moved forward, we then need to do it all again. But I'm not going to start where you think I'm going to start. I'm going to start with things that haven't worked. And the thing is, we learn more, as you know, from things that haven't worked, from things that did work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I was involved in a while ago that didn't quite go as expected. And this is the first part of the talk about understanding how to use science to change in a media-driven world. Doctor Who. So, Doctor Who, popular TV show, perhaps more popular in the UK than it is in Canada, started in 1963. It then went off the air in 1989 and came back to some acclaim in 2006. Now, the Doctor is obviously a fictional character and is a Time Lord from a planet called Gallifrey, and has two hearts, and periodically the Doctor dies and comes back, is reborn in a different human body. And these are all of the different Doctors that there have been on the left of the slide. After coming back to some acclaim in 2005, by 2006, Christopher Eccleston, bottom left, who was an actor, he just decided he didn't want to do it anymore. And this caused real problems with the BBC, who were in a frantic race to find a new Doctor. Now, at that time, I was a psychiatrist, and I was working on schizophrenia research, and specifically at gene-environment interactions and social psychiatry. And I was also a columnist for The Guardian. I'd actually previously left medicine, and I'd got a journalistic training. My long-term aim out of all of this was to be working in a medical journal like the British Medical Journal. So having seen this, I wrote a short article which was supposed to be funny, but as you know, humour is one way of making really very important scientific and political points. And I was actually used this short article to explain that there was no genetic reason why the Doctor could not be reborn as a black man or woman. And the theory behind that is, if you want to promote equity, you sometimes need to get into people's fantasies. You have to get into the fabric of society. And that's because equity has to be possible everywhere for it to occur. So I wrote this small article for the Times Online. It went viral. It got picked up widely. And I understand, and I was told that it made the BBC feel like they were under pressure. They didn't believe that the ratings would be good and good enough if the Doctor was black. Perhaps they were worried about selling Doctor Who worldwide. But on the other hand, being the BBC and being in the UK at the time, they were very interested in equity, and they didn't know what to do. And so they eventually came up with a compromise. In the next season, and this is on the right of the slide, the Doctor's assistant was Martha Jones, a black woman and a black woman medical student. They couldn't go as far as making the Doctor black, but a black medical student sidekick was a typical classic British compromise. And actually 13 years after all of this, they crowned the first female Doctor. And as you know, in 2020, they unveiled the first Doctor Who was black, a black woman. Change takes time. But what did I learn from this? Well, you see, in retrospect, what I learned from this is how powerful the media is, how powerful a 500-word article can be, and how strategic media interventions can make a difference. If I had realized the nervousness of the BBC, and if I'd been more clever and more strategic in my approach, it may have been that there would have been a different outcome. I made noise rather than making a difference because of a lack of strategy, and that's just not the way to do it. If you want to make change, rather than make noise, you have to be careful and strategic in your communication. You have to understand the environment and understand what the power is of your words if you actually want to move things forwards. And this is one of the issues of academia. Most of us try and do great work. We try and produce great papers. Some of us want to actually change things and move the world on and change the world, but we don't realize how to do it. We believe that if you just produce great work, everything will change. And we forget, and these are sage words from Charles Pascal at OISE, being right is not a strategy. Being right doesn't necessarily produce change. And you have to go further than being right if you really want to make change. And if you want to make change using science, being right is just not enough. It can take hundreds of years for a scientific invention to actually change anything. And that is longer if you have no strategy around how you are going to move from the science into action. Now, what we were trying to do for equity in COVID was clear. We needed to decrease disparities. But we really needed to think about how to do that. Now, the environment was really, really clear. The government was listening to doctors and public health. They were listening to numbers, which is extraordinary because often they don't. They were sensitive to bad publicity. The public were enraged by anti-Black racism and the death at the hands of the police. This was a time where change was possible. But if you want to actually make change rather than make noise, change being possible has to be allied with a plan. And we had a general plan. The general plan was that we would build a coalition. And so not just academics, but academics plus community, plus policymakers, all together trying to say the same thing. That there was definitely going to be an academic lever. Remember, I said we were listening, the government were listening to numbers, but there needed to be pressure which was put on the government through the media and other places to make a change. During pandemic, people are moving quickly, but they only do things they have to because there is so many things that they have to do. Also, during a pandemic, you have to present solutions. Just being a problem and just being somebody who's making noise is not good enough. You actually need to present solutions because people are working hard. And if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And then the third bit of the general plan was that once people started moving in the right direction, you had to support them. You had to support them moving in the right direction in order to get everything working. So that was the general plan. And you have to use a number of different levers. So the title of the talk is By All Means Necessary, and you'll see as we go through, we used ethical arguments, we used epidemiology, we used academic publication, we used knowledge translation, we used media stories, we actually also used media questions in press conferences from journalists to try and move things forward. We built the community coalition, we produced policy which governments could take off the shelf. We produced tools such as the EGAP, the engagement, governance, access, and protections model of how you use these sorts of socio-demographic data. And we also built relationships. All of those means were necessary in order to move things forward. So here's a classic, just to give you, put some meat on the bones. When we talk about media stories and media questions and knowledge translation, some of those are about taking what we knew, say, for instance, from the US and the UK about high rates of COVID and saying, actually, this is embarrassing. The States have got data, but Canada doesn't. How can that be? Surely we always talk about us being better than the States with regards to socialized medicine. How come they've got data? How come we haven't? Those sorts of messages make a difference. But also we wrote op-eds in the Globe and Mail. We wrote op-eds in the Toronto Star. We did media interviews across Canada. And because loads of different people are often thinking about the same thing at the same time, lots of other people were doing media interviews on the same sorts of topics, trying to put pressure on public health, on councillors, on bureaucrats, on all levels of government to get to the first stage, which is collect data. In order to help us do that and put pressure, that coalition was important. It's actually very difficult for government to ignore when academia come together with community consortiums, and we produced a table that met every 2 weeks. So we're also visible. But if you're producing pressure, as I said, in the pandemic, you have to produce solutions. So we produced a policy paper telling the government what they might do, how they might collect data. And we also produced the tool, as I said, the EGAP, on how to govern the use of that data and all means necessary to move us forward. And we got some outcomes. From having a strategy trying to get data collected, 2 public health units started collecting data in April. Toronto Public Health started collecting data in May. Manitoba, the whole province, started collecting socio-demographic data in the COVID response in May. Ontario changed its laws so that it could collect data from June. Statistics Canada added race to their data surveys. The national data collection for part of wave 1 happened from May to June. And by September, in the Queen's throne speech, there was an agreement for a national socio-demographic data plan. So good work, but that's only stage 1. Stage 1 is about getting the data, but stage 2 is about translating what you find in that data, analyzing it and translating it into action, translating what the science tells us into action. I'm going to tell you a story because stories are leverage. And stories and narratives are important. Moving from the data and from the science to a different type of energy, which is the energy that actually moves to change, requires positioning and narratives of the science in a way that makes it more accessible. And this story, and the story is an example of how you can do this. So one of the things I used to do in the UK, I'd wake up every morning and I'd wake up to something which was called the Today programme. And the Today programme was a bit like Metro Morning that there is in Toronto. You know, people listen to it because the politicians are on there and it sets the standard of news for the day. Everything that's important happens on Metro Morning. And in the UK, it's the BBC Radio 4's Today programme. But they're not always completely serious, and they do have a lighter touch. And one of the things that they do on Radio 4 is their lighter touch is that maybe 3 or 4 times a year, they interview someone who's done something special. And they sometimes interview people who have reached the age of 100. And I remember listening to a wonderful interview that they did of a woman who'd reached 100. And it was going normally, as you expect, with her telling a story of, you know, her life in general. And they asked all the normal questions. And then right at the end of the interview, they asked a question they often ask, which is, so tell me, out of all this, what do you think is the thing that got you to the ripe old age of 100? And they asked this woman this question, and she stopped and she paused and she said, well, I think it was my decision to get off the Titanic, which for me, the classic British humour, I thought was hilarious. And what had happened was she had been on the Titanic, she'd been given the ticket, she'd got on at Southampton, and she'd got off straight after she got on because she felt homesick and she didn't want to go on that trip. And we all know what happened subsequently. On that first maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, the Titanic hit an iceberg and it sank. And 1,500 of the 2,224 people on board died. Now, the narrative is not the story of the woman who I heard on Radio 4. The narrative that was important for COVID-19, and this is a narrative that I gave to the standing committee at the federal level, and that's the House of Commons Standing Committee, was that 1,500 of the 2,224 people died, as we know, but your risk of dying was related to whether you were first, second, or third class passenger, and whether you were a child, a woman, or a man. 90% of children in first and second class actually survived the Titanic sinking, but only 34% of children in third class, 97% of women in first class survived, 46% of women in third class. And because women and children went first, and that was a cultural narrative of the time, 33% of men in first class survived, but only 16% of men in third class. In fact, your risk of surviving the Titanic was lower if you're a man in a third class berth than if you worked, if you're actually a crew member of the Titanic. And the reason that these were so different was partly this idea of women and children first, but the main difference was that the Titanic had a one-size-fits-all strategy for dealing with this sort of crisis. Everybody get to the lifeboats. Problem was that if you had a third-class ticket, you were in an internal lower berth. You needed more help to get to the lifeboats than if you're in first class when you're on an outer berth. But there was no difference in the help that was available. And so people in third class died much more, they had a much higher risk of dying than people in first class. So the people who needed most help got least help in the Titanic, and that is why there are such disparities. Now, the important thing about these disparities is that they were totally predictable and they were hardwired in the running of the Titanic. This wasn't something that landed on us from Mars, that these were somehow preordained. These were exactly what the Canadian Medical Association would say were social determinants of risk, and they were considered acceptable in the strategy and the planning. And the important thing about this narrative and the important reflection of this narrative to move from the information to change was to make it clear that these were structural inequities and these were choices that had been made that led to the disparities. In fact, if the Titanic had not had a one-size-fits-all strategy, it probably wouldn't have been one of the worst maritime tragedies ever. Many more people would have been saved. And it's the same for our pandemic strategy. What this is a lost lives analysis. What I've done here, and this is a different way of reflecting that in the pandemic, political choices and pandemic choices make a difference. All this shows is the death rates that there would have been, the numbers of deaths, the numbers of lives that would have been saved if a particular country's response to wave one in the pandemic was as good as Germany's, because Germany's response wasn't the best in the world, but it was good. If Canada's response had been as good as Germany's, we would have saved 4,500 lives in wave one. If Ontario, if the US's response had been as good as Germany's, they'd have saved 86,000 people in wave one. And if the United Kingdom's response was as good as Germany's, they'd have saved 35,800 lives in wave one alone. And why I say that this magnifies and really brings forward this idea of political choices is that 81% of deaths in Canada were in long-term care homes. About 30% of deaths in Germany were in long-term care homes. And most of that 4,500 lives that could have been saved was because Germany focused not only on flattening the curve, but actually on who was under the curve. They produced enforceable guidelines for COVID-19 in long-term care and brought down the deaths. Whereas what we did in Canada was not the same. And because we didn't do the same, and because we didn't look after people in long-term care, we had many more lives lost. And in fact, if you look at somewhere like BC, which did spend much more time and much more money on protecting people in long-term care compared to Ontario, if Ontario had had as good a response in long-term care as BC, we would have saved 2,300 lives. And these were choices. We chose to try and protect our hospitals and our ICUs with PPE and with resources, and we chose to neglect long-term care. And because of that, we lost lives. And those narratives of not a one-size-fits-all, and that rather than flattening the curve, you also have to see who's under it, and you have to take political choices, were both narratives which aimed to give some responsibility, but also some energy behind getting policymakers, public health, and politicians to take responsibility for making evidence-based scientific decisions in COVID. And they had to, because the data on equity was terrible. So this is data from a webinar done by Dr. Valentin in the WHO, who showed that in 46 studies, 44 showed higher rates of COVID in marginalized groups, higher rates of infections, severity of infection, lack of access to treatment, and mortality. And those high-risk groups are older people, people with chronic diseases, ethnic minorities, homeless populations, institutional settings, and obviously specific working environments. Dr. Kelly Irving, and in the WHO webinar, was looking at what was happening in France and was trying to plot not just deaths due to COVID, but excess mortality itself during the lockdown, showing that if you were living in France and you were born in France, there was a 20% increase, 22% increase in all-cause mortality. If you were living in France, but you were born in North Africa, 55% increase. If you were living in France, but born in Asia, 90% increase. But if you were living in France, but you were born in sub-Saharan Africa, there was 114% increased all-cause mortality during the lockdown. UNICEF were predicting that 1.2 million children and 56,000 mothers could die in 6 months due to disruption of basic interventions. 132 million people were going to go hungry, and of that there were 36 million children. And in Toronto, once we got the data, we were able to show that the northwest of Toronto, coloured a deeper blue than anywhere else, was 10 times, the rate of COVID was 10 times higher. And if you look at specific populations, Arab and Middle Eastern, Black and Latin American, 6 to 9 times higher rate of COVID infection than the white population. And if you look at the poorest households, those households that have household incomes of less than 30,000 compared to richer households with incomes over $150,000, there is a 5-fold difference in COVID rates. We also found that the data shows that people who lose their jobs are more likely to have poor mental health during COVID, and that of all people, 16 to 54-year-old women have the highest rates of poor mental health on a population level. This study from Statistics Canada was of 46,000 people. You have to be careful with this study because it was crowdsourced, but even so, it's looking at 3 things: rates of poor mental health, rates whether those have changed during physical distancing, and then last, actual symptoms of an anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. And it compares in blue, the white population, to grey, which is a visible minority population in Canada. And it shows that the visible minority population are more likely to have poor self-rated health. That's the on the left-hand side. There's hardly any difference in whether health has changed during the mental health has changed during the lockdown. But when you actually try and measure generalized anxiety disorder, the visible minority population, much higher rates than the rest of the white population. But need to be careful just to note that generally 3% of the population would probably score positive for generalized anxiety disorder. But here we're looking at a huge increase, 20% to 30%, showing how the impacts that COVID is having on people's mental health, but those impacts are worse for racialized populations. So what happened once we got the data, once we started deploying these ideas that something has to be done with them? Well, as I said before, Toronto started collecting data in May, identified disparities in July, went to community to consult communities to say, what are we going to do about this in August, and then brought forward an equity action plan to the City Council in September. And so we got movement, and I say we, it's not just obviously what Wellesley were doing or what the community consortium were doing, but that general move of taking the science and adding the advocacy, adding the messaging, got leverage that changed things, that moved things forward. The law was changed, as I said before, to collect data in Ontario. Then Ontario set a table which started to analyse the data, and then later on, which is not on this slide, has started producing an actual action plan for decreasing inequities. And as I said before, there's a national plan afoot for sociodemographic data collection and use, which has come out of using, plotting how you get the science and then how you use the science to move forward. And the Public Health Agency of Canada have used all of this evidence to pull together a pandemic equity model, which I think is great because it doesn't only focus on producing a better crisis response, which is the top in blue, but also thinking about how you produce a better social response, how you build back better, and that's economic security and employment, stable housing, and other things like that that you need to build back better. And so we've moved from having no data and no plan and a one-size-fits-all strategy to a few months later having the Public Health Agency of Canada produce a model for pandemic equity, which is an amazing appliance of science. But science doesn't stop. It's great to have a model, it's great to have data, but the question is, how do you produce change? And I think sometimes it's worth remembering that a number of things we're doing now that we think of innovations of applying science to the social world are not necessarily new ways of going about things. This is a classic Ontario farm. It's a classic Ontario 100-acre farm. And if you try and work out why 100 acres, there was actually a scientific reason for this. 33 acres is the amount that one oxen can plough in one growing season. Now, this land isn't the best land. So if you plough and plant one season, one field, the next year you actually can't plough that field again. That field needs time to rejuvenate. So you only have 33 acres for 1 year. Then that next year, that goes fallow, and you go to the next 33 acres, and that's 66 acres that you've got in a planting rotation. But you have to build those barns. You have to be able to heat. You have to build a homestead, and you have to heat the thing. Then you also need to be able to fence things in. You need wood. And so there's another 33 acres, which is woodlot. So you've got 33 acres, which is which is year one, 33 acres year two, 33 acres woodlot, and 1 acre for your homestead. That's your 100 acres. And that is how they worked out in this part of Ontario how big a farm should be, and that was based on whether people could thrive, what you needed to thrive. You needed enough land to be able to thrive, and so it was scientific. And so we've done science before, and farmers are doing science today, but farmers, interestingly, do social science in some ways, and have certainly helped me in thinking about how we move science into social policy. And I'll tell you, I was speaking to a farmer on this land, and I was trying to explain to him what I do. And I said, well, you know, we take these ideas and we do research, and research is like, we grow policy ideas from research. And then after that, we take them to different levels of government and we try and sell these ideas. And the farmer was nodding and nodding and nodding. And I thought, oh God, I've lost him here. And then he got to the end and said to me, well, that's all very well. He said, but I would never put a crop into the soil if I didn't have a buyer. I work out who my buyer is before I plant. So I wouldn't be doing research unless I had a buyer for that research. Why would you do that? And this idea of the science of the market and the science of influence has significantly changed how Wellesley takes its knowledge and creates change. So we think of 3 different types of work. Type 1 work is that the government has a policy that we think can be more equitable. And we work with the government to make that, we do research to try and influence the policy that's already there so it works better for health equity. Type 2 work is that the government is thinking it might get into an area but doesn't know what to do. And we can do research that will nudge them in a certain way. And then type 3 work is that the government isn't there, nobody's there, but this is work that we think is important because we want to have the conversation, we want to build a conversation and a new narrative that we think in the future may change the way things are done. And there are these 3 types of work, and we survey the policy landscape and the government's intentions in order to try to balance our work and try to balance our influence. And this work of thinking up front about what you're doing, deciding what type of work you're going to do, and then applying a model to your whole work to make sure you're doing these different balance type portfolio, allow you to be more effective in moving science into policy and action, because like any person, you can produce movement and traction by being effective and useful and relevant. And then that allows you to come up with your grand idea that maybe nobody else agrees with, but you think is important. And that sort of raw scientific rethinking of the world, because the people who are relevant and useful get license to produce and move forward these other ideas and this other sort of more expansive science, and that moves everything forward. So all of this idea, science never stops, you have to innovate, you have to learn, you have to keep on moving, is all part of the process of moving from science to impact. So when we've been thinking about this equitable crisis response, and you know, when Toronto started working with community, they did think about the public health response. They have thought about social policy. And one of the things that I've been adding is this idea of mental health strategy. And you will see coming through at all different levels at the moment is all of these things from a standing start, none of them were happening, and they're now happening. They're now happening bit by bit. It's not all because Wellesley or a community group got together. It's because once you produce momentum, the science pushes you in certain directions. And we are moving towards an equitable pandemic response. We are moving to a recovery plan that's focused. We have to think about a national housing strategy that allows us to build back better, specifically for the Black population. We have to think about what this pandemic tells us in the long term, medium to long term, about what equitable provision of social and health services should look like. And we also have to think about why we started this pandemic without the data tools that we needed to make sure that we could push forward with equity. And so that's because science doesn't stop. When you make progress, you want more, you want to move forward, you want to do better. And that's what we need to do in order to actually produce equity. Because if we believe that diversity is our strength, equity should be our tool. So I've been talking a little bit about some of my reflections through my work on understanding how to make change in a media-driven world and how you need to be thoughtful, clear, and not just think about making noise, but think about strategically what you need to do to make change. I've talked a little bit about, okay, you've got some evidence. How does evidence move into action? What sort of narratives would you use? How can you produce strength and energy to move people in a certain way? And then thinking across about what your whole portfolio of research looks like and how you can produce an ability to do more challenging research by being relevant to the here and now and thinking about the environment in which your research works. And I am not saying I've got it right. I'm not saying that I'm a master of all of this, but I am saying that I've had a very, this year's been a really challenging but interesting year, full of opportunities. And I believe that 2021, with the vaccine coming out and various other things, despite the economic uncertainty, is a year where science could triumph and where applied science is going to have amazing opportunities to help us build back better and to be better than we were before, which of course is what we all want to do. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and also thank you for all that's happening at IMS, which of course I'm proud to be a part of. And I think it's awesome that in the 10th Ori Rotstein Lecture, we've got a member of IMS giving it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKenzie. That was fantastic.